Welcome to Winning World War II, Part 2, an online U.S. history tutorial for students in 11th grade. D-Day was certainly not the end of the war in Europe, but it was the beginning of the end. Within months, the Allies had liberated Paris from Nazi occupation, and by September 1944, they crossed the border from France into Germany itself, bringing the war directly to the German people. As British and American forces closed on Hitler and Berlin from the west, the Soviet Red Army did the same from the east. By December, Hitler was desperate. He launched a massive counterattack on the Allies in Belgium, known as the Battle of the Bulge. More Americans died in the Battle of the Bulge than in any other battle of the war, but the Nazis lost even more men and tanks before being stopped. Hitler's gamble had failed. In February 1945, Roosevelt, Churchill, and Stalin met one final time in Yalta, a Russian city on the Black Sea. They made plans for the post-war world. The Soviets would be permitted to retain some control over the territories in Eastern Europe they had conquered from Germany, and Stalin promised that the Soviet Union would join the war against Japan after Germany fell. The Big Three also agreed to support a new international peacekeeping organization, which would become known as the United Nations. All nations could be members, but a permanent Security Council made up of the allies of World War II would possess a veto power over all UN actions. In 1945, the European war entered its final phases. Allied bombing raids rained constant destruction on Berlin and other German cities like Dresden, killing tens of thousands of civilians. In April, the Soviets smashed into Berlin and captured the city. Adolf Hitler was living in a bunker underground along with many other top Nazi officials when he committed suicide. Just weeks before, President Franklin D. Roosevelt had died of a stroke. He was just beginning his fourth term as president, and his new vice president, Harry Truman, was sworn into office as America's new commander-in-chief. On May 8, 1945, the Allies accepted Germany's unconditional surrender. The day was known as VE Day, Victory in Europe. But World War II was not over. The Japanese still held out defiantly, and President Truman would need to lead the U.S. and the Allies into victory in the Pacific. In July 1945, the Allies planned for a final assault on Japan. The proposed invasion was nicknamed Operation Downfall. Military intelligence estimated that the Allies might lose 1 million men. If they defended their nation to the bitter end, more than 10 million Japanese were estimated to die. That same month, near Los Alamos, New Mexico, American scientists finally tested a secret weapon that had been in development since 1942. It was an atomic superbomb that used the power of nuclear fission to split atoms, resulting in an explosion with the power of more than 15,000 tons of TNT. 3 years earlier, President Roosevelt had authorized the creation of the Manhattan Project to develop an atomic weapon. More than 100,000 Americans had worked in top secret in 37 locations around the U.S. to accomplish this goal and to beat the Nazis, who were known to be working on a similar weapon. About $2 billion had been invested in the effort. By the time the atom bomb was completed and successfully tested, Germany had already surrendered. This had left Japan as the logical target if the bomb was to be used in the war. Harry Truman found out about the Manhattan Project only when he was sworn in as president. The decision whether or not to use the bomb was ultimately his. Some government officials and many of the scientists who had worked on the bomb wanted it to be used primarily as a warning to the Japanese. Perhaps a bomb could be detonated near Japan and would convince its government to surrender. Truman saw no reason not to use the bomb if it could save American lives. He was also looking ahead to the post-war world, where the U.S. would be, for a while at least, the only nation to possess nuclear weapons. A demonstration of the new bomb's destructive power might actually serve as a powerful warning to the Soviet Union, a wartime ally, but Truman feared a future rival. The Allies called on Japan once more to surrender unconditionally. If not, they warned, the Japanese would face prompt and utter destruction. There was no change. President Truman then ordered the first of 3 atomic bombs the U.S. had available to be dropped on a Japanese city. On August 6, 1945, the bomber Enola Gay dropped an atom bomb codenamed Little Boy on Hiroshima, Japan. Hiroshima was chosen because it had not already been heavily damaged by American air raids. The explosion leveled the city and killed about 75,000, most of them civilians, instantly. A roughly equal number of victims would die over the next several months of radiation poisoning. In this image, you can see an aerial shot of the city of Hiroshima above before the bomb. Here is Hiroshima after the explosion. Virtually every structure has been obliterated. Still, there was no surrender by the Japanese. Truman ordered a second bomb dropped. On August 9th, the atomic bomb Fat Man was dropped on Nagasaki, Japan, causing similar death and destruction. Finally, on August 14th, VJ Day, the news of Japan's surrender was announced to the world. World War II was over, but at a horrific cost to both sides. The use of atomic weapons to end World War II remains extremely controversial. The bombings of Hiroshima and Nagasaki in 1945 remain the only two times in history that nuclear weapons have been used in a war. As time has passed, an increasing number of people have questioned President Truman's decision. Some historians believe that, given more time, Japan would have eventually surrendered without a nuclear attack. Some people have gone as far to call the use of atom bombs a war crime. Truman, for his part, never publicly regretted his decision. He believed he had saved millions of lives, Allied and Japanese, by using the weapons. It should also be noted that at the time, Americans overwhelmingly approved of the bombings of Hiroshima and Nagasaki. They had ended the war. Millions of soldiers who would have risked their lives to invade Japan could now return home to their families and live their lives. Most Americans believed that the Japanese had gotten exactly what they deserved. From the perspective of the 21st century, historians can see both points of view more clearly. The controversy will continue to be debated, as it should. More than 400,000 Americans died to bring World War II to an end. This is a terrible statistic, but it actually pales in comparison to the lives lost by the other major powers. Great Britain lost more than 450,000 soldiers and civilians. Japan lost as many as 3 million. Germany lost between 6 and 8 million. And in the Soviet Union, an unbelievable 24 million military and civilian deaths may have occurred. Worldwide, World War II may have caused the deaths of 60 million people. Quite simply, it is the most dangerous and destructive period of human history ever. Despite its losses, the U.S. exited the war in a position of strength. Wartime production had finally ended the Great Depression, and the American economy was the strongest in the world. A new era of middle-class prosperity began and would last for generations to come. Almost all Americans believed that they had fought and won a good war that saved the world from dictatorship and enslavement. And winning the war had ended the Holocaust. As Allied troops closed in on Germany in 1944 and 1945, they discovered numerous Nazi death camps, and the full extent of Hitler's crusade to rid the world of Jews and other inferior races was revealed. Millions had already been murdered, and the Allies liberated concentration camp survivors who were little more than skeletons. All of humanity was shocked. By almost every measure, the United States entered the post-war era as the world's leading superpower. Only the Soviet Union, damaged as it was by the war, could now rival the military and economic might of America. Germany would wind up as two nations, a democratic West Germany that the U.S. would help rebuild, and a communist East Germany controlled by the Soviets. And from 1945 to 1952, General Douglas MacArthur would lead a full Allied occupation of Japan, totally transforming the country's government and economy. Japan would emerge as an ally, not an enemy of the West. The U.S. continues to maintain major military presences in both Germany and Japan to this day. War criminals were prosecuted and punished throughout the former Axis. The best-known example of this is the Nuremberg trials, governed by an international military tribunal set up by the major Allied victors. In Nuremberg, Germany, 22 top military and political leaders of the Nazi Party were indicted and tried for war crimes. 19 of them were found guilty, 12 were sentenced to death. Subsequent trials in Nuremberg indicted more than 185 Germans, doctors, judges, industrialists, and military officers for crimes against humanity. About half were found guilty. In October 1945, the United Nations, the peacekeeping organization that Franklin Roosevelt had envisioned, became a reality. The 5 permanent members of the Elite Security Council, Britain, France, China, the Soviet Union, and the United States, all ratified the UN's charter, as did 46 other original UN member states. Membership has eventually grown to 193 nations, basically every nation in the world. The UN's headquarters is located in New York City. Did the hard-fought peace last after 1945? Yes and no. Thankfully, there has never been a World War III. But within a few short years, the United States and the Soviet Union grew hostile toward each other and remained so for more than 40 years. The Cold War that resulted would be a global struggle between democracy and communism, with the constant fear of nuclear war threatening the future of humanity. Other tutorials in this series cover the Cold War in depth and continue this story. Mary McLeod Bethune of Florida was one of America's most prominent African-American leaders when she was appointed by President Truman to represent the U.S. at the founding conference of the United Nations in 1945. No African nation or any other nation sent a black female delegate, so Mary McLeod Bethune represented all the world's women of color at the creation of the UN.